Hello, everyone. Welcome to Northampton County Historical and Genealogical Society's Sigal Museum. We are absolutely delighted to bring you a virtual program today from one of the Sigal Museum favorite speakers, actually. We have Reverend Richard Taylor with us today. He is a member of the Society. He gave a very popular talk on the coming of the Pennsylvania Germans from Palatine, Germany, a few years ago at the museum, and we are absolutely delighted to be celebrating the release of his new book today. He has a brand new book called Congregations of the German Reformed Church in the United States. It is a beautiful, weighty tome. It is a wonderful genealogical resource for all of you who are researching Northampton County ancestors or ancestors in the US, and would like to come to our library. He has a whole listing of churches where you can find church records to trace some of your ancestors who were members of these churches. So we're delighted that today he's going to be talking about the history of the German Reformed movement actually in Northampton County, and how some of these earliest German settlers came to the US and influenced our thinking, the development of the United States, and also participated in the Revolutionary War with some radical acts here. So I would like to welcome Rick. Welcome, and we'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased. Thank you, Carrie, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm so thankful to the Sigal Museum for giving me the opportunity to share about the new book and to introduce you to it and to some of the history of the Reformed Church. And it's coming into Northampton County. And then at the end, I'll say a little bit about the book as well. A few years back, when I did give that address that Carrie spoke about, we had a question and answer period at the end, and I was talking about how Reformed and Lutheran churches often share buildings together as union congregations. And during the question and answer period, a person raised their hand and said, what's this Reformed thing you're talking about? I've never heard of Reformed churches before. And it's true that not very many churches actually have the Reformed name in them anymore, particularly in our area. And so I thought I'd say a little bit about that. Partly the reason that we don't know that name is because we live in a former British colony and we all speak English. The Reformed movement actually began in German-speaking Europe. As it spread across the continent, it was still generally called Reformed, but when it crossed the Channel into Britain, it began to be described in terms of forms of government. So when the Anglican Church and the Church of England continued to have bishops, the church came to be known in America as the Episcopal Church because the Greek word for bishop is episkopos. But in Scotland, where they had a more typically Reformed form of government, the people actually elected the elders and the pastors of their own churches, and then a group was formed of the elders meeting together, which was called the presbytery, and then synods and a general assembly. And that form of government is called Presbyterian because of the Greek word for elder is presbyter. And back in England, where the Puritans arose, and they wanted really a more Reformed church than what they were getting from the bishops, they tried to form synods, but the English government wouldn't allow them to do that. So each local congregation participated in democracy and elected its own pastor and its own lay leadership, but they couldn't have the synod, so people began to call that form of government congregational. So if you know churches that are called Reformed or Presbyterian or congregational, or in our modern day where different Reformed groups have united as the United Church, all of those are part of the Reformed tradition. And there is a group called the World Communion of Reformed Churches, which in the United States includes the United Church of Christ, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Reformed Church in America, which comes from Holland Dutch roots, and some other groups. All over the world, that communion of Reformed churches is actually the third largest communion of Christian churches, following only Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. But with that introduction, let me get back to German-speaking Europe and tell you how it all began. Gutenberg's Bible was published in the mid 1450s in town, right in the Rhine Valley. And the beginning of printed books really changed the process of education, the process of understanding the Bible, the process of involving more people having access to ideas that they would not have had access to before. And so the publication of books really led to the Protestant Reformation. October 31st, 1517 is given as the traditional founding date of the Reformation, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the door at the church at Wittenberg. But that was actually just a protest to certain ideas within the church. The church didn't suddenly separate on that date. It was after people began to think about Luther's ideas and other ideas that had been fermenting around Europe that actions began to be taken. And it was 5 years later in Wittenberg, for example, when people began locally to change the forms of worship, to try to conform them to biblical examples, and have a simpler form of worship in the vernacular of the people. And a mob got so excited about doing that, they rushed to some of the Wittenberg churches and destroyed some of the statues and the art. And the princes got really upset about that, and they sent Luther back to Wittenberg to put a lid on it and calm things down, to have a more moderate form of Reformation. But it was just 1 year later, after that change in Wittenberg, that a Reformation was begun in Zurich, Switzerland. Actually, in this very building you see, the Grossmünster, the old church in the center of Zurich, begun by Ulrich Zwingli. In 1525, the year after that, a couple of years after that, the Latin Mass was replaced with the Eucharist in the German language, served by a minister who was facing the congregation on the other side of a simple table. Zwingli had been strongly influenced by humanist writings such as Erasmus, and he gained some notoriety before coming to Zurich because he opposed the practice in the Swiss canton where he formerly lived, where the government formed mercenary armies that they were renting out to other princes around Europe. And he was opposed to that kind of activity. Now, both the Lutheran Reformation and Zwingli's Reformation found authority in the Bible, and they were both concerned about human needs, about poverty, about the suffering of widows and orphans in their communities. And similar reformations began to take place in many German cities, and other ideas were being put on the table, and people were wondering, well, what's really going on and what's happening? So Philip of Hesse in 1529 called together a meeting in Marburg. It's called the Marburg Colloquy, to talk things over and find out if they could agree on some common ideas. The meeting included Luther and Zwingli and Oecolampadius, the reformer in the Swiss university city of Basel, Martin Bucer from Strasbourg, Philip Melanchthon, and many others. As they talked about what was important to them, they found that they actually agreed on 14 theological points, but they came to a point of disagreement when it came to the idea around the sacrament of communion or the Eucharist. The Catholic Church had taught the idea of transubstantiation, that the bread and the wine actually become the real body and blood of Christ. Luther put forward an idea which came to be called consubstantiation, that the bread and the wine continue to be bread and wine, but they also are the real body and blood of Christ. Zwingli took a more humanist or scientific point of view, that the wine and the bread were outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. Luther sternly disagreed, and he refused to shake hands with anybody who disagreed with him on that position. So the colloquy ended with no particular final decision. So the Reformation churches then at that point broke into two groups: the Lutheran churches, who agreed with Luther, and the Reformed churches, or the churches of the Reformation, that actually would tolerate a variety of ideas. Many of the Reformed leaders actually thought that Luther might be right on the communion issue, but they thought since communion was such a mystery, they didn't want to insist on pinning down one point of view that would be in place forever. But once they did divide over theological issues, other differences appeared between the two groups. Many Swiss cantons had already developed as primitive democracies without royalty or princes. That put them in an ongoing conflict with the Holy Roman Empire. But these democratic ideas that were taking place in Switzerland began to permeate into the Swiss Reformation and into the Reformed churches. Now, Luther had been protected by the German princes. Now, the princes wanted to be free of the taxes and other obligations that they had to have to Rome, but they didn't want to give up their power and their rule. So, relying on Romans 13, Luther developed a concept of two realms where the church and the rulers were separate. The rulers, he believed, were chosen by God, but the church was separate to follow the Bible. Reformed churches, on the other hand, were more willing to challenge governmental failures and injustice, such as John Knox did in Scotland or the Puritans did in England. John Calvin, who was a second-generation Reformed leader, had fled from his home in France for refuge in the French-speaking city of Geneva. Reformed people who were still in France felt persecution and the obligations of the Catholic-connected government in France. And they asked Calvin what to do. And Calvin wrote them back, introducing the idea of churches under the cross. He said you should meet then in private, in somebody's home, and there form a covenanted community, recognizing each other as part of the community, supporting each other in electing your own elders and deacons and your own pastor. And so you can see both the democratic idea as well as the resistance to governmental policy. You can see here in this building how the Reformed churches moved to simpler worship in chaste settings. They used bread rather than wafers, and they were centered on the preaching of the word. You'll note here in the Heiligen Geist or Holy Ghost Church in Heidelberg, the clear glass windows and the plain table with no fence about it. The Reformed also emphasized personal sanctification and covenanted communities responsible for each other. Luther's stress on specific doctrines produced the 1530 Augsburg Confession, written by Melanchthon. Most Lutheran churches still use the unaltered Augsburg Confession and Luther's Catechism. Conversely, the Reformed, tolerating more ideas, have several testimonies of faith, such as the Heidelberg Catechism. Here's the outside of Heiligen Geist Church in the city that includes the oldest university in Germany. The Catechism was written by two of the professors at the university in 1563. The Swiss adopted the Second Helvetic Confession, which was written in 1566. The 1646 Westminster Confession was written by Scots Presbyterians and English Puritans, and the stricter 1619 Canons of Dordrecht come from Holland. The United Church of Christ even wrote a new statement of faith when our union took place in 1957. These varied statements reflect what is often called the motto of the Reformed churches: Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda, which means the church reformed, always reforming. While the Reformation changed and reformed the church, new issues such as slavery or racism or industrialization might show the church to have been involved in sin or gotten God's will wrong, and that causes the church to seek again and again a new reformation to conform to the rule of God.
So how did these Reformed people get to America? Puritan and Holland Dutch Reformed churches came to America with colonial charters. And after the 1707 Union of Scotland and England, Scottish settlements also began to grow. All of those settlements were part of governmentally supported and approved colonies, generally well-funded and militarily defended. but not so the Germans. Neither Switzerland, which had been separated from the Holy Roman Empire in 1648, nor the Holy Roman Empire itself had foreign colonies. October 6, 1683 is often given as the date of the arrival of the first Germans in the British colonies. On that date, William Penn welcomed about 12 Mennonite families in Philadelphia. But the first large migration of Germans that came to America arrived in New York in 1710. The Reformed Church had become the dominant church in many Swiss cantons and in some German provinces, particularly those along the Rhine Valley between Switzerland and Holland. Notable among those provinces were Hesse and Nassau, Jülich, Mark, Berg, and most prominently the Palatine Electorate, whose capital was Heidelberg, the home of that oldest university in Germany. During the period of 1685 to 1715, just before these Germans began to come to America, conditions in those Rhine provinces had significantly deteriorated. The Reformed churches in France had, the government there had taken away the toleration that they had, and so thousands and thousands of French Reformed people fled into the Rhine provinces, fled into Switzerland, fled into Holland. In some places, they overwhelmed the abilities of small alpine valleys to feed people and looked for new homes as people who spoke a different language often. In that very same year, 1685, the Protestant elector Palatine died, leaving no heirs, and both the French king and the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna decided they wanted to put their person in charge of the Palatinate. And so these armies burst out against each other of these two Catholic powers that just began to destroy the villages and the cities in the Rhine Valley. Over thousands of villages were built. Here's a picture of the town of Speyer. It's actually spelt wrong on your screen there. These two forces just decimated the community and actually virtually destroyed the city of Heidelberg. Catholic services were imposed in Protestant communities. And hardly had that war come to an end when the King of Spain died, also without an heir, and France and Vienna both decided that they wanted to impose their person on Spain and get all those really rich gold colonies in America along with it. So the fighting started again, and the armies moved into the Rhine Valley, again burning down the same places they burnt down years before. On top of that, in the winter of 1708-09 was the worst winter on record, and crops were destroyed, vineyards were destroyed, and people didn't know what to do with the war, the famine, and the lack of toleration of their religion. By the end of 1709, 30,000 refugees from the Rhine area made their way to London, England, seeking help. The majority of those refugees came from the Reformed Palatinate. Those large numbers, imagine 30,000 refugees coming into your city all at one time, led to opposition, and the government decided they wanted to get rid of all these people. They sent thousands back to the continent and thousands more to Ireland and nearly 1,000 to the Carolinas. But the largest group was sent to upstate New York to be a buffer or a target between the French in Quebec and the British and Dutch settlements in New York, that if any war broke out, these people would be the people who would have to bear the brunt of it. In 1710, over 3,000 people came over, all crowded into 10 ships. Many died on the journeys over. And this was the largest single migration of any group to colonial America at one time. At the start of the winter, just as they arrived in New York City, they were set up the Hudson Valley to where they were supposed to provide provisions for the British Navy. They had no homes yet, and winter was coming on. And then the British drafted all of the men to fight in wars against the French. And the women and children began to starve, and protesters were imprisoned and arrested. In 1722, it just happened that William Keith, the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania, happened to visit Albany and learned about the problems of these refugees were having. And he told them about religious liberty in Pennsylvania. Many of them then decided, under the leadership of Conrad Weiser Jr. and others as well, to make their way down old Indian trails or the Susquehanna River to Pennsylvania. With them came more, and large groups came down from New York into Pennsylvania. Most importantly, that migration changed the letters going back home to people in Europe, saying that the safest place to come, if you really want to come to America and get away from all those European problems, is to come to Pennsylvania. A few Germans and Swiss had made their way here before this large migration. John Philip Boehm, the son of a pastor from Hesse Castle, came to Montgomery County in 1720, and he began teaching as he had done in Europe. He encountered a few other scattered Germans who, on learning he was a pastor's son, asked him to preach. Soon they were requesting communion as well, but not being ordained, Boehm didn't want to do that. He refused, but the pressure continued. Finally, he took up Calvin's idea of churches under the cross. And he said, if you'll get organized, write constitutions, elect your own deacons and lay elders, and call me officially to be pastor, I'll go ahead with this. And so in 1725, they went ahead and adopted constitutions, called him to be pastor of 3 tiny congregations in Montgomery County. And this was actually right around the same time that some of the New Yorkers were beginning to come down into Pennsylvania, and just before the letters going back home began to bring people over. Now, starting churches from people coming from reformed lands was difficult in America. One of the things Boehm had to teach them, in Europe, the churches and the churches were maintained and the ministers were paid from taxes. If you wanted to have a church in Pennsylvania, you had to learn stewardship and giving and have to contribute. So that was one of the things that Boehm was teaching his congregations. In 1727, just 2 years after Boehm organized his churches, George Michael Weiss, who graduated from Heidelberg University and was ordained over there, had heard about Pennsylvania being the place to come. So he led a group of Palatinists to come to Pennsylvania. And having regular credentials, he immediately challenged Boehm's ordination. He said, well, there weren't any other pastors doing that. But Boehm's congregations protested, and they appealed to the Collegiate Dutch Reformed Church in New York City and asked them to ordain Boehm. The people in New York sent a letter back to the classes of Amsterdam and said, what are we supposed to do about this letter? And the people in Amsterdam said, well, if you follow what Calvin wrote, they did the right thing, allow them to have their pastor. And so Boehm went up and got reordained by the pastors in New York City in 1729. Meanwhile, Weiss, being aware of the scattered Germans in the colony who were in need of pastoral care, organized the Philadelphia Church and one in Germantown. And then he wrote to the Heidelberg Consistory asking for aid for America. Still suffering in poverty and under foreign influence, Heidelberg said, oh, we can't, we're stuck here. We can't really do anything. So they asked the same synods in Holland if they could reach out to help the poor in Pennsylvania. And the Boehm and Heidelberg appeals reached Holland about the same time. In addition to approving Boehm's ordination, they encouraged reconciliation with Weiss, who went up to New York for Boehm's ordination. Weiss soon returned to Europe looking for some further aid, and then when he came back to America, he went to New York to take some pastorates up there. So Boehm became the main Reformed pastor in Pennsylvania, and he visited many places where he heard German people were, and he sent back reports to Holland. Though it wasn't until the mid-1740s that the Hollanders really began to offer some aid. After many requests, the synods of North and South Holland agreed to offer aid and recruited Michael Slaughter to come to America and assess the needs of the churches and organize a representative group of elders. A native of St. Gall in Switzerland, Slaughter had attended the Dutch University in Leiden, so he could speak Low Dutch as well as High Dutch. He came in 1746, and the next year he led the organization of the Cetus of Pennsylvania. He presided at the first meeting, but the next year Boehm was elected as the first president. The Cetus was made up of clergy and lay elders chosen by the churches, and it was considered to be a mission under the direction of the synods in Holland. They in turn offered to recruit qualified German-speaking clergy for the colony and pay their way to America and send additional support. This 1750 map shows American colonies before they became independent. In Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's Quaker and Anglican residents had spread from Philadelphia west to the Susquehanna to open up trade routes with settlements on the Chesapeake. When the Mennonites and Anabaptists came, they mainly settled in Lancaster County. So this new migration of Germans looked for good farmland that the Penn government said was open for settlement. And so northern Montgomery and Bucks counties, and then Lebanon, Berks, Lehigh, and Northampton counties, all below the Blue Mountains, as you can see on the map, became the key German areas. This map also shows counties with Reformed churches in that year and other settlements from 1710. The darkest counties are those that were under the care of the Cetus. Almost all of them are in Pennsylvania. The middle shade are those other German Reformed churches in the country, those in New York, under the care of the Dutch churches in New York City, and also independent congregations that were scattered. The lightest colors show you other refugees' colonies that were just starting or abandoned, escaping conditions that get over here from Europe. They had scattered to Maine and southern New Jersey and the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia. Now, despite Lutheran predominance in the Protestant population in Germany, the early Rhine migration was predominantly Reformed, and the Reformed Cetus was formed before the Lutheran Ministerium was formed. But as the colonial period continued with more Lutherans in Germany and hearing about Pennsylvania, more Lutherans began to arrive. Here we are with a map of Northampton County in its present geographic defining that shows the earliest churches up to 1800 of the Reformed Church in Northampton County. In 1734, Boehm wrote a letter to the Dutch leaders about the existing congregations in America and sent them places where he knew there were enough German Reformed settlers to organize congregations. One which he called Saken, or we would say Sauken, makes 1734 the traditional founding date of the Lower Sauken Church, the first Reformed church in Northampton County. But it was a while before they could secure leadership. Incidentally, someone once claimed that one of the churches up in Moore Township was founded in 1723, but most serious sources dispute that. In May 1735, the Reverend Maurice Getty from Zurich, Switzerland, arrived in Philadelphia, the leader of 200 people who hoped to settle in the Carolinas, and it included his 17-year-old son, John Henry, and his daughter, Anna, and her recently married Swiss lawyer husband, John Conrad Wirtz. Sick from the journey, Maurice was brought on shore, and then he died the next day. But young teenager Henry promptly began preaching, settling in Gossenhappen. Henry organized a large charge of churches, specifically including Sauken, possibly in 1736. He gained a preaching license from the Presbyterians in 1737, but he left the area in 1740, taking up service with the Dutch Reformed on Long Island the next year. His brother-in-law, not able to get a lawyer's job in an English colony, had been teaching for a while, but he also began to preach in 1742, and he began to serve the Lower Sauken congregation in 1745, and by 1747 had added a congregation called Forks of the Delaware, which became the parent church of the First Church in Easton. By 1750, Wirtz moved to some German congregations in New Jersey and applied to and was ordained by the Presbyterians. As I've said about this map, the other German congregations north of the river by 1800 came at a later date after the Penns said that populations could move there. As the different areas began to be settled, the dotted lines show you that congregations moved to be in more central locations to where the Germans had put their farmers. The red circles on some of the churches show union meetings where the Lutherans and the Reformed shared their meeting place together. Noted Revolutionary War leader Benjamin Rush, in typical British style, called the Reformed Germans Presbyterians. But he noted that, quote, most of them object to being designated by the name Calvinists, owing to their relaxation of some of the peculiar doctrines of Calvinism. In cooperating with the Lutherans, they were clearly at the tolerant end of the Reformed spectrum. The American Revolution was a challenging time for everybody, as we know. The new revolutionary government in Pennsylvania on June 13th, 1777, voted to require every male citizen within a year of that date to take an oath renouncing King George and to give allegiance to the new American government. Lutheran historian Charles Gladfelter quotes the diary of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the founder of the Lutheran Ministerium, on his agony over this issue. Since he had given an oath to the British crown when he arrived, and as a good Lutheran, he believed in the two realms, that the princes were not to be bothered by the churches, he could not imagine taking the new oath. And he works over this in his diary, and he wished he could just sit out the war and support whoever won at the end of it. Now, it needs to be said in respect to Muhlenberg that two of his sons actually became great American patriots, one even becoming the first Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States. But father had left Philadelphia within a week after the adoption of the Declaration. And his family, though, and those sons finally convinced him to make the pledge and support the Americans. But Gladfelter also in his history reports that some, quote, German pastors, most of whom were Reformed, appear to have had no difficulty in taking the oath of allegiance when the first call for it was sounded, unquote. Of course, what we're dealing here with is both the Reformed commitment to democracy in the church and democracy eventually in the world, and their willingness to challenge governments that they consider to be unjust. So let me give you a few examples by talking about some people here in Northampton County. The first Northampton County Reformed pastor that I ever came to know about was John William Weber, Johannes Wilhelm Weber. I first became a pastor of an old German Reformed church in 1968 in Western Pennsylvania. And that was during the time of the Vietnam War, and it was the same year that Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. The people out in that church knew about their German Reformed history, and they celebrated Weber because he was the first German-speaking pastor to come over the mountains and serve the churches, even before the technical end of the revolution. He served many churches in Westmoreland County, and he became the founder of the first church of any denomination in what we now call Pittsburgh in 1782. Weber was born in Wittgenstein. He came to America in 1764 as a school teacher and studied with Caspar Weiberg. He was ordained as a minister in 1772, and he immediately came up here to Northampton County and became pastor in Plainfield Township, and a few years later to the church at Mount Bethel. He also took a church up in the Poconos above the Blue Ridge and a few in New Jersey. And he stayed here for a decade. And he was one of the very first clergy people in the whole colony of Pennsylvania to pledge his loyalty to the new revolutionary government. But the records say that he made his pioneer journey and left Northampton County because the people here were mispleased. The local people were mispleased because he preached too much of the war. It was a great pleasure, though, to me as a young activist to remind the people that their great hero who pioneered Western Pennsylvania came there precisely because he preached too much about the war. Another early pastor here was John Daniel Gross, who was born in Zweibrücken and studied at the universities of Marburg and Heidelberg. He also came to America in 1764 just past the end of the French and Indian War. He soon became pastor in Egypt, Jordan, Nevis, and Allentown in what is now Lehigh County, but was then part of Northampton County. He was so skilled that within 5 years, he got elected to be the president of the Cetus. In 1770, he moved to the Lower Saucon Church and also took on a church in Bucks County. But he was not that happy there. So in 1773, he took a German church in Kingston in the Hudson Valley and then added the old German church farther north in Canajoharie Sand Hill in the Mohawk Valley. When the revolution broke out, Gross became the chaplain to two different patriot regiments in New York. He was probably the most skilled leader in one of the regiments, so he had to take command in defending a patriot fort against the British forces. In another battle, he ran back to the Sand Hill Church to recruit a bunch of church members to come and help along with the battle and defeat the British. After the war was over in 1783, Gross became the pastor of the German Reformed Church in New York City, where his parishioners included Baron von Steuben, the Prussian general who had come to America to shape up Washington's army at Valley Forge, and the church treasurer, who earlier had come over as an immigrant from the Palatine and a town called Waldorf, who is now treasurer of the New York church, whose name was John Jacob Astor. While he lived in New York City, Gross taught at Columbia, and they were so pleased with his work, they gave him an honorary doctorate. And in 1795, he wrote a book on moral philosophy, and that was the first book written by anybody in America, or whatever background ethnically, on that topic. And it includes a strong condemnation of slavery. My third example is perhaps the most famous, is Caspar Dietrich Weiberg. In 1760, as the French and Indian War was beginning to fall down, the three churches up in the Dreisbachs area in northwestern Northampton County and the three churches in the Eastern Charge asked the Cetus, please, the war's over, people are beginning to move and settle here. Can you find us some educated pastors to lead our congregations? Weiberg was a native of the county of Mark, and he attended the University of Duisburg, and he committed himself to come to America the next year in 1761. But because his wife was ill, they delayed until 1763 before they could get here. But then he became the first settled German Reformed minister in Northampton County. The Easton Charge, which he took up, had Plainfield, and Easton, and the church in Greenwich, New Jersey, and he became the first Reformed pastor in Dryland. But after he'd been here only 1 year, the very next year, the Reformed Church in Philadelphia became vacant. And that was vastly important because as the German Reformed people were now coming to Pennsylvania, you needed to have a good active person down there to welcome the Germans and direct them to where German people were settling. So he resigned from Easton and he went down to Philadelphia. He also became a president of the Cetus, and in a few years he helped his church build a new building just a few blocks from Independence Hall. And he also became a chaplain in the Revolution. And he was asked by the Patriots to preach to Hessian troops that they had captured. And he knew Zwingli well enough to know that he did not particularly like mercenary armies that were working for somebody else. So tradition says that when he preached to these Hessian troops, he told them to go AWOL, quit the government, quit the army, don't work for the British. And if they would do that, he would be nice enough to tell them where the German people were settling. And if they'd go up there, they might find a pretty girl and be able to settle down. That's not all there was to Weiberg. He also was committed to education, and he trained many of the young ministers like Weber. He was also a trustee of both Rutgers and Penn and a founder of Franklin and Marshall College, and he was granted honorary degrees by both Penn and Princeton. And that work continued with his son Samuel, who after serving in North Carolina, preached the first Protestant sermon west of the Mississippi, and he became the first Protestant minister in Missouri. My last example is Abraham Bloomer. His only American charge was that same 4-point charge of Allentown, and he followed Gross there. And he served that parish for over 30 years, one of the longest pastorates of a colonial minister. The son of a pastor, he came from Grabs in Glarus in Switzerland, and he'd studied at the university in Basel. He came to America in 1770. Highly literate, Bloomer spoke 4 living languages, as well as knowing Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. And he also became a CEDA's president. And Bloomer also became a chaplain in the Revolution. And at that time, as you can see on his plaque, he was the chaplain of the 1st Battalion of Northampton County Militia in the war. In 1777, as the British approached Philadelphia, the Patriots were concerned that the Brits were going to melt down the bells in the city and turn them into metal and cannon fodder to fire against the Americans. Perhaps at a suggestion from Weiberg, all the bells in the city were taken down, they were put into wagons, and they were hauled to a place where they felt the British would never go and find them. And so among all of the bells that came up here, the one from the old State House, which we now call Independence Hall, was hidden in the basement of Zion Church. You know, that bell, it's the one that's engraved with the biblical quote, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." These pastoral examples are a celebration of American patriotism. But remember, they were all immigrants. Each one of them had been in America less than 14 years when the Declaration of Independence was written. None of them had English as their first language. They preached and worshiped in German. They came to serve democratically governed churches, and the poor peasants they came to join and help were refugees from war and famine who had chosen Pennsylvania because of its religious liberty. What then does it mean to be an American? Our local churches in this area kept close to their German roots. In 1820, the church formed local groupings of churches called classes, and one of the first was originally called Northampton. And it always included most of this county, and for its first 60, 70 years, most of Lehigh County and parts of other counties around. And all the handwritten minutes of that classes survive. Business was conducted in the German language until the late 1860s, after the end of the Civil War. And I have to tell you, they're in old German script and they've never been translated. If somebody wants to volunteer some help and volunteer to do that or make a grant to do that, let me know about that. By this 1800 map, you can see denominational growth over the mountains and Weber's churches in the west, and the growth in western New Jersey and North Carolina. You might also even notice a few new church starts in Kentucky. While there is still a pocket of independent churches in South Carolina, the spread of German churches in New York has declined, and the scattered coastal settlements from 50 years earlier are all gone. Things in Europe changed radically in the next 50 years. The churches had changes, their geographic entry, and also they engaged in unions and mergers with other churches, and the nations themselves changed. We don't have time to explore all of that, but you can look at a map here of the Reformed Church as I'll quickly move through the progress of the denomination. By 1850, you can see that they have spread out through Ohio, into Western New York, and parts of Indiana, and even some scattered odd places far away. By the 1880s, Reformed people from Hungary had begun to migrate to America. And the Reformed Church in America was the first to reach out to them, founding its first Hungarian churches in 1890. In this map, the darker counties show Hungarian churches that were founded before the 1934 merger. 3 of the 53 Reformed churches in Northampton County were Hungarian. On this 1900 map, you will also notice growth in Wisconsin and Iowa and other plain states, much of which the latter were Germans coming over from Russia. And then finally, this 1934 map shows the extent of the church in 1934, the year of its first major union with the Evangelical Synod of North America. The latter group represented 19th century and later migrants from parts of Germany where the Reformed and Lutheran established churches had been united as the Evangelische Kirche. The new church became known as the Evangelical and Reformed Church. Red on the map indicates places where there were still living German Reformed congregations at the time of the merger. Blue indicates counties where the churches had either transferred to other denominations or had died by that time. In 1957, the E&R Church merged with the Congregational Christian Churches to form the United Church of Christ. This Northampton map tells you, gives you an overview of all the Reformed churches in the county. In total, there were 53 Reformed congregations founded in Northampton County as we now define the county. Black dots indicate 27 current churches of the United Church of Christ, all of which have Reformed backgrounds. One blue dot indicates a Reformed congregation that's withdrawn to a schismatic group. Black circles indicate either a former site of a church that moved a significant distance to another location, or churches that merged with other congregations. An X indicates churches that closed. Red circles indicate that the Reformed churches at each location were for at least part of their time in a union relationship with a Lutheran congregation. The last union relationship here in the county actually ended only in 2015, 5 years ago, when the Lutheran congregation in Farmersville disbanded. Now I'd like to just add a few comments about the new book. It includes a lengthy introduction that can tell you more about the German Reformed Church, its origins and history in America, and you can discover more details about the origins of the most common homes of the early immigrants. Since the church was a connectional body, there are also summary histories of each synod and classes. And like most religious bodies, there were schisms and reunions, and these are explained. Other ethnic congregations, such as Winnebago Indian and Japanese, are noted. And you can discover about the mergers that the denomination has entered into and learn something of the new partners. All of the national maps in this presentation are included in the book, along with several charts and illustrations, and there are indexes and an extensive bibliography. Here is one of the pages from the book, the beginning of the Northampton County section, that lists over 4,000 congregations that were part of the denomination, and notes about 1,300 Lutheran churches that were in union arrangements. These are a wonderful help for genealogists. For example, if you believe your ancestors were Reformed and you know the county they lived in, you'll find what churches existed there in the specific periods that they lived in the area. And then you can look for those churches' records in other sources. Up through the 19th century, you can also find listed the charge that the churches belonged to. Many pastors had several churches at the same time, and they would keep all of their records of all their baptisms and marriages and so forth in the same book for all of their churches. And then they left it with one of their congregations. So if one church's records don't have the information you're looking to, if you know the churches that were in the same charge with them, you might check out those and find the records that you're looking for. If you know your ancestor's specific church, you can discover if it merged with another church, or if it transferred to another denomination, or if it closed, and if so, when. Now, some churches have changed their names through the years, and many have had various post offices. And so you can get really confused. But thumbing through the county list, you can find the other post offices, you can find the other names of the churches. And many local churches had popular local names that were often named by the people who gave the land or something like that. And you won't find those names in most active names of churches today. For instance, in this county, there were churches called Old Moore and New Williams and Irish Settlement, Indian Creek, Henry's, Hayes's, Apples, Millers, Schneiders or Snyders, And again, you'll be able to find out what churches those names are referring to. Copies of this book may be secured through the Sigal Museum, and here's how they can be contacted. If you live at a long distance, you can contact me to get the book. Here is my website and my email address. If you'd like to find out more information about the history of the Reformed Church, or are looking for the records of a specific church, you can contact the Evangelical and Reformed Historical Society at the contacts shown here. I hope, Carrie, that we'll be able to show these contacts again at the conclusion of our session. Thank you very much for signing up to come in today and your attention. Thanks again also to the museum for giving me this opportunity to share with you, and we'd be willing to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
All right. Everyone, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I see somebody has a question. Then you can unmute your microphone. Oh, hold on, we can't hear you. Can you try that one more time? Unmute your microphone.
Who, me?
Hi, Deborah.
I'm Deborah of Ron Clemens. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I don't know if you were talking to me, but I do have a question. My sister, Marcia Ron, who's here with us, and I am on a kind of treasure hunt of love, searching the records of our home church that closed at the end of 2019. We found that there are no records in the church or that we found in the ENR Historical Society for the first 160 some years. They claim their founding to 1732, and their records do not begin until 1909. They are Alsatian Reformed people from the Alsace-Lorraine district between France and Germany. If anybody has any information on these people who did not join the Cetus until 1793, we would love your help. Thank you.
Many people don't know that Alsace was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and they sprechen die Deutsch in the old days. And so there's lots of Alsatians. My first church in Western Pennsylvania had Alsatian families as members.
Well, and I'll also put in a plug here for our wonderful Jane S. Moyer Library that is located on the third floor of the Sigal Building. And I see Cindy Smith, one of our volunteer librarians here. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Cindy, but if you are having a genealogical conundrum, some of our wonderful volunteers are still coming in behind the scenes because the library is closed to the public right now, just to keep everyone safe. But if you have some questions, feel free to get in touch with us at the museum, and some of our librarians are doing research behind the scenes, and they could take a look and see what they can dig up for you if we have anything that is local, or they can dive into some of the online genealogical records as well. So please feel free to contact us at the museum if you're looking. Now I see a question here. Bobby McMullen is asking if we could give the contact information to purchase the book again. Absolutely. If you would like to call the Sigal Museum, our phone number is 610-253-1222. What I will also do, everyone, since we had the link to Rick's publishing website as well, and also to the church email, what I will do after the program is over, I will post something on the Sigal Museum's Facebook page, which will have contacts. So if you go onto Facebook, it's Sigal Museum's Facebook page. I'll also put something on our events page of our website. And you can also always call us at the museum and we can link you directly with Rick as well, if that's all right with you, Rick.
Sure, very good.
Do we have any other
This is Dick Borg. I'm archivist for the E&R Historical Society. Deborah, I wonder if you've been in contact with Allison, because the society did receive 20 or some boxes of records from Alsace. I don't think they're all organized yet, but you might keep tabs with her on how that's progressing.
Yeah, we volunteered to help go through those records, and she said she would let us know when they're ready to go through those boxes. But we understand there's nothing there before 1909.
I've discovered that a lot of records that I wasn't expecting to be this way are down in Philly at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and the Genealogical Society of Pennsylvania. A lot of the very old church records.
Now, I'll just say Historical Society of Pennsylvania, as many of you know who have been trying to do research during the pandemic, as we've all been at home, they have been closed to the public for quite a while. We know they have their wonderful new director, David Brigham, who actually was at Allentown Art Museum for years. We're hoping they'll be able to open up soon. I think they have a line of research requests going, but we're hoping they'll be able to be accessible to all of us again fairly soon. Well, and for those of you who tuned in a little bit after we started the discussion, I would like to just show this beautiful book again of Rick's, but I wanted everybody to see the spine, see how beautiful and thick this is and all of these years of research. So again, I would love to just say cheers to you, Rick, for putting so much time and effort into this and for making it so incredibly accessible and fascinating to the rest of us as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
May I just make a comment? I just want to thank you. I enjoyed the talk. As a professional genealogist and a direct descendant of Reverend Boehm, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Allison had sent me the link from the Reform Archives.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm Barbara Brown-Zickman. I'm very much involved with UCC history. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is the translation of material that still is all in German. And we've been talking about different ways where we could get that translated. Is there something going on that I don't know about? I'm on the Historical Council of the denomination. We have a couple of people who are doing translations. Very simple. We just photocopy something and send it to them. And they do it wherever they live, and then they send it back. So what we need to do is get more of this accessible in languages that people who are now researching can do. And there's so many different ways of encountering German. So I'm really interested if there's anything going on.
It's difficult because much of the 18th century stuff is, of course, handwritten.
Right.
And you can't find very many people that are able to transcribe and then translate that. The E&R Historical Society did get a grant, and Ed Quinter, who's on the talk this afternoon, did some transcribing of the records of the Susquehanna classes from the late 1830s and 1840s. And I twisted my older brother's arm, who's a retired German professor, to do the translation. So that's ongoing, but if anyone knows of other people that can read the handwritten German script, I'd be very happy to learn about them and their contact information.
Good. I think there's some other people who would also like to pool that. We need to get people working together on this.
Amen.
All right. If we don't have any other questions, and I will say if I know many of you know each other, but if you are looking to link and find yourself some German translators, please feel free to reach out to the museum as well. And I think we can link you all together through Rick, and I'll say a hi to Ed Quinter out there. Hello, Ed, because I'll say I have a husband who is a German professor at Muhlenberg College and is about to retire next year, and he knows Ed quite well, so maybe we can try to rope him in as well.
Oh my goodness. This is Caroline Dunleavy. I'm the new executive director at the ENR Historical Society, and I know many of the people on the call, but it's just a coincidence. I'm actually originally from the Allentown area, and I went to Muhlenberg College, and I studied German at Muhlenberg. I probably am past your husband, but I don't know. I studied with Dr. Wegener. I studied with Dr. Kippa, they were fabulous. So I just had to say that, and I actually see some people that I think I know on here from other parts of my life, not ERHS, from my family of origin and growing up in the Lehigh Valley. So it's nice to see everyone.
Hello and welcome.
Small world, Carrie.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And you
I
mentioned,
want to know who is the direct descendant of Bame? I couldn't see the name. Who said she's a direct descendant of John Philip Bame?
I go by Bobby. My correct name is Roberta. And I was raised, Caroline, in Salem UCC Church in Doylestown.
Are you Bobby McMullen?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hey, all right. We've met. Right.
You're active in DAR also.
DAR, right, and the ERHS. Yeah.
And as I said, I'm a professional genealogist. Plus, I volunteer a lot for DAR and preparing applications in a past state and national officer. So.
Yeah, and I think I asked you once if you could write up a little something about how useful the ERHS
yes,
is
I did, and I
people.
submitted it to our state newsletter, and they did put it in there.
Oh, great.
Good.
Yes, Allison is wonderful.
Yes, she is. And Bobby, yes, I'm a current member at Salem. I actually live in Bucks County and commute over to Lancaster. That's great.
Yeah, I live in Quarryville, which is about 17 miles south of Lancaster.
Right.
But as I said, I was raised in Salem, and last I was in the church was when we buried my mother from there.
Okay.
I was active in the pastorate of Reverend Dieter.
Okay.
And that goes back a long time ago. But anyhow.
Thank you. And I'm glad we were able to get the link out for Rick. I think that was helpful.
Yes, Allison sent me the link a couple of days ago. So I've been a life member of the Reform Archives for a long time. Richard has met me. I'm in there a few times too.
well, and we're also hoping that we can entice Rick to come back once again, because I know he is doing a great deal of additional research, and we talk a lot about Brainerd and Tatamy. So when we know we are going to have another presentation, because it's such a joy, we will be getting that word out to everyone again. But thank you so much for joining us. And one more thank you to Rick. Thank you very much. Everyone, enjoy your weekend.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Take care.